The Calloway family appeared to be the embodiment of perfection. Their home, a pristine colonial style house on a peaceful, tree lined street, seemed like something out of a magazine. The lawn was always manicured, the flowers in the garden bloomed in perfect harmony, and the air around their house felt almost too serene. Sarah Calloway, with her warm smile and cheerful demeanor, was the kind of neighbor everyone adored. She greeted everyone she met with a kind word, her arms often filled with a basket of freshly baked cookies or flowers from her garden. Michael Calloway, her husband, was equally charming. A successful financial advisor with a reputation for generosity, he was often seen helping neighbors with their taxes or organizing community events. Their children, Emma, the eldest at 10, Liam, a spirited 8-year-old, and Chloe, an adorable toddler, seemed as delightful as their parents. Emma's studious nature, Liam's playful energy, and Chloe's sweet giggles often drew compliments from passersby. The children were frequently seen playing outside, their laughter echoing down the quiet street. On Sundays, the family attended church together, sitting in the front pew like a vision of unity. To everyone around them, the Calloways were the perfect family, stable, loving, and happy. Yet, perfection has a way of concealing shadows. What the neighbors didn't see were the cracks in the Calloways' carefully curated image. Behind the perfectly drawn curtains of their beautiful home, a different reality existed, one far removed from the idyllic picture painted for the world. For now, the facade held strong, and the Calloways continued to charm their community. No one had reason to doubt their sincerity, nor did anyone suspect the horrors that would one day come to light. The secret they guarded was buried deep, hidden in plain sight. As time went on, subtle signs began to emerge that something wasn't quite right within the Calloway household. The first noticeable change was in Emma, their eldest child. Once a bright, bubbly girl who excelled in school and loved to share stories about her day, Emma began to withdraw. Her once vibrant personality dimmed, and her enthusiasm for learning seemed to vanish overnight. Teachers noticed she was distracted, hesitant to participate in class, and sometimes absent altogether. When she did attend, Emma appeared anxious, flinching at sudden movements and avoiding physical contact with others. It wasn't the behavior anyone expected from the child of such seemingly attentive parents. Liam, the middle child, also began to change. Known for his boundless energy and charm, he started arriving at school with dark circles under his eyes, a stark contrast to his usual cheerful demeanor. His teachers observed bruises on his arms, which he brushed off with vague explanations about roughhousing with friends. Chloe, too young to articulate what she might be feeling, often appeared somber. Her big brown eye held a sadness that seemed out of place for a child her age. Concerned teachers and neighbors occasionally voiced their worries to Sarah, but her explanations were always convincing. She would laugh off the children's bruises as accidents or insist they had inherited her clumsiness. With her radiant smile and disarming charm, she effortlessly deflected suspicion, making others feel guilty for doubting her. Behind the doors of their picture-perfect home, however, these changes in the children's behavior were not coincidences. They were the first cracks in the Calloway's polished exterior, cracks that hinted at the darkness lurking within. But the world outside remained blind to the growing storm, lulled by the illusion of the family's perfection. Behind the immaculate facade of the Calloway home lay a grim and suffocating reality, one that no neighbor or friend could have imagined. Inside, the warmth and love that Sarah and Michael so skillfully projected to the outside world were replaced by an environment of rigid control and unrelenting fear. The rules were strict, almost militaristic. Every aspect of the children's lives was meticulously dictated: what they ate, how they dressed, and even how they spoke. Any deviation, no matter how minor, was met with swift and often harsh punishment. A spilled glass of milk could result in hours of isolation. Forgetting to complete a chore might mean skipping dinner entirely. Sarah, with her obsession for control, would deliver icy reprimands that cut deeper than any physical punishment. Michael's temper, on the other hand, was explosive and unpredictable. His punishments were not just severe, but calculated to instill terror. The children learned quickly to tread carefully, walking on eggshells in their own home to avoid inciting his wrath. The basement, initially used for storage, was transformed into a place of dread. It became a site for punishment, its darkness and isolation serving as tools to break the children's spirits. Locked away for hours or even days, Emma, Liam, and Chloe learned to suppress their tears, knowing that crying only made things worse. The air in the basement was damp and cold, and the silence was broken only by their muffled sobs. Despite the escalating abuse, the children remained trapped. They were too young and too frightened to comprehend the gravity of their situation, let alone seek help. For the world outside, the Calloway family continued to shine as a beacon of perfection, while within their home, fear and pain reigned supreme. The contrast between their public image and private reality was stark and devastating. The turning point came when Emma arrived at school one day with a black eye and a fractured wrist. It was impossible to ignore. Her teacher, Mrs. Hartman, had long suspected something was wrong, but had hesitated to act, unsure if her suspicions were warranted. Seeing Emma's injuries, however, left no room for doubt. Mrs. Hartman gently approached Emma, asking her what had happened. Emma looked down, her voice barely a whisper, as she repeated the excuse her mother had drilled into her. She had fallen down the stairs. Mrs. Hartman wasn't convinced. She knew Emma's explanation didn't align with the severity of her injuries. That afternoon, she made the difficult decision to file a report with Child Protective Services, CPS. It was a step she didn't take lightly, but her instincts told her the children needed help. CPS launched an investigation within days, arriving unannounced at the Calloway home. Sarah greeted them with her usual charm, her smile as radiant as ever, and welcomed them inside as though she had nothing to hide. The investigators found a spotless home, impeccably decorated and meticulously maintained. The children, coached beforehand, were polite and cooperative. Emma, Liam, and Chloe parroted their parents' stories, insisting they were well cared for and happy. Sarah's explanations for the bruises and injuries were delivered with convincing sincerity. Emma was clumsy, Liam loved gymnastics and often got hurt playing, and Chloe was going through a phase of being overly sensitive. By the time the investigators left, they were almost convinced. The case was closed, marked as a false alarm. Sarah and Michael had triumphed once again, their facade intact. But behind the closed doors, their anger at being scrutinized boiled over, and the children's suffering only deepened. For them, the worst was yet to come. Inside the Calloway home, the tension had reached unbearable levels. Sarah and Michael, furious that CPS had dared to investigate, tightened their grip on the children. Punishments became even more severe, their paranoia feeding an ever-growing need to control every aspect of their lives. The basement, once a sporadic punishment space, became a permanent prison. The windows were sealed with black paint, and heavy padlocks were installed on the doors. The children were often confined there for hours, sometimes days, with only the barest necessities: a thin mattress, a single blanket, and a bucket for a toilet. For Emma, the eldest, the burden was overwhelming. At just 10 years old, she tried to shield her younger siblings from the worst of their parents' wrath, often taking blame for things she hadn't done. This self-sacrifice earned her harsher punishments, but Emma endured, her only solace the thought of protecting Liam and Chloe. The darkness of the basement was suffocating, but even more crushing was the sense of helplessness. Food became another weapon of control. Meals were rationed, withheld entirely for minor infractions, or used as rewards for perfect obedience. Liam, always resourceful, began scavenging scraps from the trash in desperation, only to be beaten severely when caught. Chloe, still too young to understand the full scope of their ordeal, grew thin and pale. Her once bubbly laughter was replaced by a quiet, fearful demeanor, her big eyes filled with a sadness no child should know. Despite their parents' cruelty, the children clung to each other for comfort. In whispered voices, they shared dreams of escape, though none dared to act. Every day felt like an eternity, each moment a reminder of their entrapment. To the outside world, the Calloways remained a picture of suburban perfection. Inside, however, their house had become a living nightmare. One cold December night, Emma made the most courageous decision of her young life. After enduring years of torment, she resolved to escape and seek help, knowing it was the only way to save herself and her siblings. Over the past few months, she had observed her parents carefully, noting when their attention waned and when the locks on the basement door were left unguarded. She practiced loosening screws in secret, hiding tools and supplies in a small corner of the basement where her parents wouldn't think to look. That night, as Sarah and Michael argued loudly in the living room, Emma saw her chance. With trembling hands, she retrieved a stolen screwdriver from its hiding place and worked on loosening the screws of the basement's small window. Her heart pounded in her chest as every twist of the screwdriver seemed impossibly loud. Finally, the window gave way, and Emma squeezed through the narrow opening. The icy wind bit into her skin as she crawled into the night, her hands and knees scraping against the frozen ground. Outside, the world felt enormous and unfamiliar, but Emma pushed forward, driven by desperation and the faint hope of freedom. Barefoot and bleeding, she stumbled across the snow-covered yard, leaving a faint trail of blood behind her. The cold pierced her thin clothes, but she didn't stop. Her only thought was to reach the nearest house, the Miller's home, just a few yards away. When she reached their porch, she banged on the door with all her remaining strength. The door opened, and Emma collapsed into their arms, her frail body trembling. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let them take me back." The Millers, horrified by her condition, immediately called the police, setting the stage for the Calloways' downfall. The arrival of the police at the Calloway home was swift and decisive. While paramedics rushed Emma to the hospital, officers approached the seemingly perfect house that had hidden unspeakable horrors. Sarah and Michael were caught off guard. Sarah tried to maintain her composure, flashing the same practiced smile that had disarmed so many before. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted, spinning lies about Emma being a troubled child prone to outbursts and self-harm. Michael backed her up, feigning shock and outrage at the accusations. However, the facade they had so carefully constructed began to crumble when officers searched the house. It didn't take long for them to uncover the basement, its padlocked door, the blacked-out windows, and the stifling air of secrecy. What lay beyond that door horrified even the most seasoned investigators. The room was cold and damp, with chains bolted to the walls and filthy mattresses on the floor. A bucket served as a makeshift toilet, and scattered around the room were tools that could only be described as instruments of torture. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and it was clear this wasn't a temporary setup. It was a prison. Hidden under loose floorboards, the officers discovered diaries filled with Emma's heartbreaking accounts of abuse. Every page painted a vivid picture of the years of torment the children had endured, detailing punishments, starvation, and the constant fear of their parents' wrath. Photographs and medical evidence corroborated the accounts, leaving no room for doubt. As Sarah and Michael were handcuffed and led away, neighbors gathered outside, stunned into silence. The couple who had once embodied suburban perfection were now revealed as monsters. That night, Liam and Chloe were removed from the house and placed into protective custody, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The trial of Sarah and Michael Calloway was a media spectacle that captivated the nation, drawing attention to the unspeakable horrors that had taken place behind the doors of their seemingly perfect home. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement, and families affected by the case, all eager to witness the downfall of the couple who had turned their children's lives into a nightmare. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, her demeanor cold and unfeeling, as if nothing had happened. Michael, attempting to salvage his dignity, portrayed himself as a misunderstood father, but his attempts to deflect the truth were futile. The prosecution presented a damning case, supported by irrefutable evidence: the children's testimonies, Emma's heart-wrenching diaries, photographs of the torture chamber in the basement, and medical records detailing years of physical and emotional abuse. Emma, now 11 and living in a loving foster home, bravely took the stand and recounted the horrors she had suffered. Her voice trembled as she described the long nights spent chained in darkness, the pain of hunger, and the constant fear of her parents' violent outbursts. Liam, just 8 years old, fought back tears as he spoke of the cruelty he had witnessed and endured, particularly the brutal punishment he received for trying to comfort his little sister, Chloe. Though Chloe, too young to testify, could not speak for herself, her medical records painted a clear picture of the trauma she had suffered. The defense's attempts to argue that the Calloways were merely strict parents crumbled under scrutiny. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Sarah and Michael were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that many felt did not adequately reflect the extent of their cruelty. As the Calloways were led away, the children's journey toward healing had just begun. Emma, Liam, and Chloe were placed in separate foster homes, each receiving the specialized care they desperately needed. Emma, once the protector, now focused on rebuilding herself, using art therapy to process her trauma. Liam, though still struggling, began to trust again, finding solace in his writing and stories of courage. Chloe, though too young to fully comprehend the pain, began to heal as love and care surrounded her. The Calloway children's story became a catalyst for change in child welfare, pushing for better oversight and training to prevent such horrors from happening again. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty became a symbol of hope for others who had suffered in silence. Though the scars of their past would never fully fade, Emma, Liam, and Chloe proved that survival was possible. And as they moved forward, their story was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of love and compassion.